all. To live fully, outwardly and inwardly, not to ignore the external reality for the sake of the inner life, or the reverse. That's quite a task. Wrote Esther Etty Hillesum, who was a Dutch woman who was imprisoned in Jewish refugee and deportation camps during the early 1940s in the northeastern part of the Netherlands. Etty was a young woman who was a student and had an emotionally turbulent upbringing with her family of origin. Grew up in a Jewish family, then living under occupation by the Nazi regime and those who coordinated with them amongst the Dutch authorities. She was imprisoned in deportation camp Westerbork during the early 1940s before eventually being deported to Auschwitz with all the members of her family. It's her journal and her writings that represents what I have been referring to as learning how to dance with the rain. For a woman who was facing unimaginable anger, fear that I would feel, she found a way to move away from that towards a life of gratitude, love, and resilience in the face of unimaginable horror and the ever-present fear of death. She showcased a mystical and contemplative mindset, did Etty. And I found it interesting that she began writing these journals, these wonderful pieces of information and insight and theology, on the advice of her psychotherapist, a Jungian therapist who encouraged her to help deal with the emotional trauma of her upbringing and the emotional trauma of the world around her by writing this journal. Referring to what Jung calls the inner God archetype and instinct, this instinct to make oneself whole, the drive that stirs every soul to become what it is and become all that it is. This path of transition and transformation. So Etty is this example of learning how to dance in the rain, this metaphor of reconstituting oneself, recapturing the split-offs of emotional trauma, and learning to have gratitude for the stuff that got us to where we are today, even when it's not all good. Embracing that inner God archetype for Etty meant turning to her religion that she had not been particularly well-versed in or observant of, and finding a new way to understand it. In fact, Etty writes that she does not blame God for the terrible suffering of the Jewish people and of her family. She writes, "But one thing has become increasingly clear to me, that you, God, cannot help us, that we must help you to help ourselves, and all that really matters is that we safeguard that little piece of you, God, in ourselves, and perhaps in others as well. Alas, there doesn't seem to be much you yourself can do about our circumstances. So neither do I hold you responsible. You cannot help us, but we must help you and defend your dwelling place inside us to the last." That is incredible. Learning to dance in the rain, whether that rain is external circumstances of extreme evil, like Camp Westerbork, like the containment camps on our southern border in this country, whether they are internal circumstances like mental health challenges, physical, emotional trauma from our youth, religious trauma from our past or present. If we are encouraged to spiritual growth, I believe that Etty shows us a path towards wholeness that we might learn from and grow with. She's a prime example of learning to dance with this new reality. So throughout this sermon, I want to highlight some quotes from her wonderful writings that teach us a few practices about building resilience, some practical tips to aid our body and mind on our journey towards wholeness. These also come from a list from Cal Berkeley that are scientifically backed ways to build resilience. The first one they talk about is naming of your situation and facing your fears. It's a kind of exposure therapy That if you've ever been to therapy, one of the first things you have to get comfortable with is being honest and open and naming your stuff. For us as Unitarian Universalists, the history of someone like Ethelred Brown is an important opportunity to name the reality of our situation, to face the fear and discomfort, what Mark Morrison Reed calls the black hole in our white UU psyche. That the treatment of people of color by the dominant majority of both Unitarians and Universalists was not always sterling. And that our unwillingness to talk about that, our unwillingness to talk about the unwelcomeness towards trans folks early on, even towards gay and lesbian folks early on, towards people of color, that we were way ahead of the rest of the country, but not on everything. And our unwillingness to talk about that history, sometimes our unwillingness to talk about the discomfort of the history in this congregation when it comes to racial matters, the inability to face those fears makes it feel uncomfortable when it does come up. Learning how to dance makes us feel discomfort, either with our own personal histories, our congregational histories, the family of origin stories that we all carry, the stuff that we've been told not to talk about, to sweep under the rug. Is anyone's family like that? We don't talk about that? Yes. If you have ever been to a program, the program, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, the first things, say, hi, my name is, and I'm an alcoholic. You name it, claim it, face it. And working with people with behavioral health challenges, one of the key understandings is to recognize that you have an illness, and then you learn to dance with it. If you're a fan of the Harry Potter series, you'll know the quote that fear of a name only increases fear of the thing itself. That if we do not talk about those things, if we do not put sunlight on them, it makes it harder to deal with in a way that leads us towards wholeness. That honesty and courage about what Robert Johnson calls our lights and our shadows is an important step towards healing. Right? Your lights and your shadows. Your lights are your strengths that you show to the world. You shine out this little light of mine. Your shadows are not your bad stuff. It's not necessarily your weaknesses. Sometimes it's the stuff that you can't see because of your ego, maybe your super ego, if we're going to get Jungian. It's the stuff that you can't see until someone points out to you that you need community to deal with your lights and shadows. I don't always want to wrestle with that part of myself. That makes me uncomfortable. But the more I do it, and the more exposure therapy I incorporate, the easier it gets. So if we are to do that, and you start to feel uncomfortable wrestling with some of these topics, another practice is simply breathing and meditation, intentional breathing. Breathing through the moments when topics make you feel a little tense. For me, it was always talking about race and my own sense of superiority when I was working in the mental health hospital, right? I thought I was different than, other than. And it made me feel uncomfortable to wrestle with those. Learning how to breathe through those moments, literally breathing deeply through those. There's research that says we use something like only 30% of our lung capacity for normal breathing. And it's when you get stressed, it's even less. That's why taking a deep breath feels so different and so good. That if you start any type of meditative practice, any kind of yoga, the first step is to focus on your breathing. When we have folks who are in mental health crises, focus on your breathing. Panic attacks, focus on your breathing. Anxiety, focus on your breathing. It's so simple and yet so profound. That going through tough times, talking about these hard conversations, being in crisis, sometimes you can practice something called compassionate communication with others and with yourself. Right? Eddie Hillison talks about this. He says, sometimes the most important thing in a whole day is the rest we take between two deep breaths, or the turning inwards for 5 short minutes. That the rest we take between 2 deep breaths. You find yourself in a place of anxiety, that taking some deep breaths can create positive results. If you're having a group conversation or conversation with someone in crisis where things start to feel a little tense, compassionate communication says, take a breath before you respond. Settle yourself. When in doubt, something I use in the psych hospital, if things get a little tense, you just start singing. You can't argue if you're singing. It's hard to feel anxious when you're singing. Using your breath for something constructive rather than for defensiveness or denial about facing your fears or naming the reality of the situation. Practicing regular meditation has plenty of scientifically proven benefits. The most interesting one of which I found is stimulation and regulation of the pineal gland. We're going to do a little neuroscience today. The pineal gland. What is the pineal gland, McKinley? I'll tell you. It's this little piece right in the center of your brain that's connected to your retina, and its job is to notice when it is light and dark outside, and to present feedback to your brain about when it is time to go to sleep, to reset your biological clock, to bring you back into balance and get you back into rhythm. Yes, noticing light and dark and holding them in balance to reset you and get you back into rhythm. I could not make a better metaphor if I tried. Sometimes the most important thing is the rest between two deep breaths. The next step, reframing or changing the narrative about what's going on in your life. That when you've got the story, the real history, the treatment towards people of color, the diagnosis, the struggles with hard conversations, what now? Oftentimes we, as you use, and mostly middle-class people, we want a quick solution. Right? When the 2016 election happens, we want immediately results. We want to do something the next day. That's a cure model. We want a cure. Magical cures often. Not always a cure. A better model might be recovery. How do we learn to live with this new reality and recover slowly, working with that new reality day by day, despite disappointments and setbacks, because recovery is not always linear in one direction. Sometimes you make progress, sometimes you have setbacks. It's all part of the process of recovery. Building resilience is about a recovery model. I am an alcoholic. I have a mental illness. I am a racist in recovery. These are all things that require resilience, that require naming, facing fears, breathing through them, and then reframing the narrative. Because regardless of what your thing is, and we all have a thing, regardless of what it is not the whole of your identity. People who struggle with mental illness, with addiction, that is not the whole of their identity. It is a part of your identity, of my identity, something that has to be held. Maybe it's a shadow, but you also have the light. And learning to hold them in balance, to get back in rhythm, that's the idea. The Sufi poet Rumi speaks to those who are struggling with feeling inadequate because of their stuff. Reminds us to stop acting so small. You are the universe in ecstatic motion. That you are a microcosm of all the love and joy and divine spark held in one body, surrounded by electricity and neurons and pineal glands, that you are a living, breathing miracle, that you are loved and worthy of love, so act like it. To build resilience, we need to remember that. The most difficult step that Eddie Hillison presents such an incredible example of, what we refer to as recapturing the split-offs. Learning to reintegrate the parts of our narrative, our lights and our shadows that may be in our past, that we've learned to try and forget, that we've swept under the rug. It's the hardest part of learning to dance in your new reality, to dance in the rain. The painful, the traumatic, the obstacles, the suffering. That reframing, respecting, to me literally to see again, to see in a new way, to see them for what they are. Lights and shadows. part of our story. So for me, it's a family history of mental illness. It's something that I've been aware of for a long time, something I am supremely aware of every day, that I am at risk for one day my brain not being on my side. That's a terrifying reality, but it's reality. So it's why I'm so passionate about this, because I am at risk, so I'm kind of selfish in that way. But it also makes me grateful every day, not just for the health that I have, my mental and physical health, but also for the illness that's in my family history, because it makes me grateful for everything. That doesn't make the illness good. That doesn't make me cheer for it, but it does help me hold it in balance. Because as hard as it has made my life, it has also helped me to find peace and purpose and gratitude. It's like my pineal gland is getting me back into rhythm. Brene Brown, who is from Texas, shout out, says that the key to resilience in even the most extreme circumstances, survivors of genocide, survivors of traumatic shootings, find that the key to resilience, to being able to bounce back, is gratitude. That if you cannot express gratitude for what you have, even the smallest things, then you cannot empathize with someone who has lost. Eddie Hillison writes, as life becomes harder and more threatening, it also becomes richer, because the fewer expectations we have, the more good things of life become unexpected gifts that we accept with gratitude. She is writing from a Nazi prison camp. And she finds a way to say, I have fallen in love with Westerbork because of the gratitude and peace that I have found here, the contemplative mind and the balance that she's found. She moves away from hatred and anger towards gratitude and even forgiveness. She's able to cultivate forgiveness in this situation. And that's hard for me to understand. We heard about the powerful nature of redemptive forgiveness today. But that is not the same thing as saying forgive and forget. Right? Eddie Hillison writes, she writes, not saying forgive injustices out of moral obligation. She says, the absence of hatred in no way implies the absence of moral indignation. You can be morally indignant about the stuff that's happening on our southern border, about some of the terrible racist policies in this country, but not allowing hatred to overtake your entire being, not letting that become your identity, allowing for redemption and transformation of yourself and others while working to change the structures that cause such morally repugnant acts. That is finding the balance of the light and the shadow. In the Eastern tradition, right, you have the yin and the yang, that when you get to the very bottom, when yin is most powerful, there is also the yang circle. And at the top, when the yang is most powerful, there is also the yin circle. Balance. Finding the rhythm. Learning to dance with a new reality. As life becomes harder and more threatening, it also becomes richer. To find gifts that we accept with gratitude. Despite everything, life is full of beauty and meaning. The last stages is to access positive emotions, to practice self-compassion. And when you feel tense and anxious, learning to sing and breathe. When recapturing your split-offs starts to make you feel a little, sing and breathe. And then when you're able to do it, if you're able to find some kind of peace, rejoice. Celebrate yourself. Give yourself a little love. It's something that you do with people who are in crisis. When they're able to calm down, you celebrate that. When you find therapeutic resources that work, you latch onto those. Rituals that connect you to other people and help build resilience. Hold on to those. And tell us how you feel about it. There's a reason I'm so insistent on that when we do joys and sorrows. Hillison writes, thinking gets you nowhere. It may be a fine and noble aid in academic studies, but you can't think your way out of emotional difficulties. Anybody here try to think their way out of emotional difficulties? To ask KP, she'll tell you. Hillson writes, that takes something altogether different. You have to make yourself passive and then just listen. Reestablish contact with a slice of eternity that is within you and within me. Learning to practice self-compassion is part of learning how to dance with the new reality. Sometimes that's literally dancing, right? Like what we did with Kathy. The effects of literally moving have been shown to stimulate the pineal gland. Remember that. The whirling dervishes, the Sufi mystic dancers, their dances that have been scientifically shown to stimulate the pineal gland. Dancing has large cultural impact across the world. It's hard to feel sad when you dance, but there are dances that express sadness. It's incredible in that way. I invite you to find how you dance, whether that's actually dancing, whether that is dancing with music simply by listening to it, whether it is by dancing through the movement of yoga. If you've ever practiced yoga, you know that one of the final steps of yoga is to raise to your third eye. What the third eye is your chakra, but it's also your pineal gland, the thing that brings you into balance. My friends, Eddie Hillison found that balance, becoming all that she was supposed to be, reconstituting herself, that inner God archetype instinct that Jung talked about, on a journey towards wholeness while residing in a place of mass murder. Even then, she found a way to practice resilience and resistance with love and joy, refusing to give in to hatred. She wrote, I see no other solution than to turn inwards and root out all of the rottenness there, because I know that I no longer believe that we can change anything in the world until we first change ourselves. And that seems to be the only lesson that needs to be learned. That the practice of building resilience for ourselves makes us better people of faith. That our practice of talking about hard things, breathing through them, recapturing our split-offs, changing the narrative, celebrating joy, makes us better you-yous. Ethelred Brown received a letter from Langston Hughes when he was in Harlem, asking Ethelred, what is the kernel of your faith? So I ask you, what is the kernel of your faith? What is it that leads you towards wholeness? And how can we build resilience through play, through dance, through joy, through singing? How can we find balance of mind and heart, body and soul, light and dark, yin and yang, to become reintegrated beings of love? Eddie writes, ultimately, we have just one moral duty: to reclaim areas of peace in ourselves, more and more peace, and to reflect it towards others. And the more peace there is in us, the more peace there will be in the troubled world. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with us. May it be so. Amen.